the final chapters in Victoria's notorious underbelly crime era was closed today when former drugs kingpin Tony McKell was sentenced to 30 years in jail.
Melbourne's underworld has a wide history, distinct for its complex, deep-rooted connections to organised crime, with powerful figures capturing both the fear and fascination of the public. Remember Squizzy Taylor and McKell, legends in the most punishing sense of Melbourne's underworld. Their power struggles and high-stakes rivalries still fascinate the world. You are about to watch the most feared rulers of Melbourne's underworld. The criminal activity in Melbourne can be traced back to the early formation of the city, with noticeable criminal organizations in the form of the razor gangs of the 1920s. Reinforced by both prohibition and recession, these gangs thrived on vices such as liquor, gambling, and later drugs. Gradually, crime networks grew more extensive, particularly with well-defined hierarchy systems occasionally replaced by chaotic formations, featuring well-known leaders all over mass media outlets. This environment of the Melbourne crime scene is different from what is found in Florida, as it is in constant evolution, especially to suit new markets such as narcotics, arms and ammunition dealing, and fancy white-collar crime. What tends to distinguish Melbourne's underworld is not simply its turf war interactions, but rather periodic cycles of violence and collaboration. Personal, familial, or territorial enmities have time and again led to dramatic underworld wars. And again, Melbourne has earned for it a violent crime scene. This power struggle is evolving all the time, maintaining syndicates in constant change, and has a set of regular actors who can either make pacts for some time or openly feud. The Australian media has continued building such characters as anti-heroes or tragic legends, creating curiosity in the public domain. Melbourne's criminal history primarily began in the early 20th century, notably through key characters like Joseph Squizzy Taylor, whose operations firmly set the city's tone. The state's prohibition laws and the deterioration of Melbourne's economy brought about organized crime bands that successfully utilized legal services and extremely ruthless authority in the underground drug trade. As one of the pioneer gangsters under Pender's criminal empire in Melbourne, Taylor may be characterized as the city's first celebrity criminal, famous for his charm and ruthlessness. Taylor was born in 1888, and his crime list includes a wide range of crimes, from theft to grand racketeering. He had become a kind of kingpin of petty crime rings, forming a syndicate of Melbourne black market in alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. He was a charismatic man and deeply involved in capturing people's interest. The media made him a superstar. Such an amalgam of Taylor's operational thuggery with tactical thinking contributed to creating a more professional crime franchise in Melbourne. Besides Squizzy Taylor, others like Norman Brune, a razor-wielding thug from Sydney, introduced Melbourne to the violent gang warfare of the 1920s, which was particularly brutal and chaotic. The brutal methods used by Brune to control the migrants influenced local gangs to follow a similar policy of enforcement. Thus, the same continued to concentrate Melbourne's underworld for decades. The confrontations and affiliations of such characters established Melbourne to the nickname the Gangster's Paradise. And these thugs, whose numerals iconize Melbourne as a crime city like Chicago, raised the city to crime prominence and stature. During this period, the early matrix for a future organized crime was established, changing the Melbourne criminal scene from loosely affiliated gangsters to criminals who worked in affiliation. This redefinition made it possible to pursue rivals and enforcers systematically through force. Melbourne's crime scene would set the early tone for criminal dens produced by early 20th century gangsters such as Squizzy Taylor, which modern syndicates would later adopt and improve. Their presence marked the era when Melbourne had what most citizens of their generation could not even conceive of: a syndicated criminal society, syndicated in a manner that gangsters we knew on the streets were different from gangsters whose influence would define crime in Melbourne for many years to come. Melbourne gangland wars are considered to be one of the most violent crime periods in Australian criminal history. The war involved such persons as McKell, Alphonse Gangatano, and Jason Moran. This violence erupting from the conflict between the Carlton crew, to which those men belonged, and other gangs led to more deaths, betrayals, and power battles that went on for more than a decade, making a very disturbing mark on Melbourne streets, and equally a permanent dent on Melbourne crime cell. McKell, who labeled himself as a civilian mediator and force figure, became an important personage in Melbourne's gangland war. Gatto's body built and relationship was a respected figure from both friend and foe, even as a negotiator who was also a threat to Carlton crew. Although he had never been implicated in any act of violence, Gatto was famous for solving fights and, as such, commanded respect among Melbourne's criminals. His association with the gangland wars, particularly in the period preceding and during the 00s, established his power as he pursued diplomatic policies very different from those of his peers. Gatto emerged as a celebrity with a string of high-profile hits, one of which was the shooting of hitman Andrew Benji Veniamin in The Line of Duty, which just cemented Gatto's legend as a peacekeeper in an ever-violent world. Alphonse Gangitano, the Black Prince of Lygon Street, drank, fought, and revealed his way through North Melbourne's Italian community. Also identified as Les, Gangitano was infamous for his short fuse and capacity to assault opponents publicly, thanks to the Melbourne gangland wars. Gangitano was one of the principal members of the Carlton crew. He was a reckless gunman who ceaselessly attacked other crews and sometimes his own. He was aggressive mainly to partners and competitors due to his rather unpredictable character. He also shot dead 2 other people in Elizabeth Castle before fleeing to Gibraltar, where later, in 1995, the criminal was involved in the so-called Esquire Hotel Brawl, during which Gangitano assaulted clients of the establishment using a pair of knuckle dusters, thus proving his increased dangerousness and complete disrespect for order. The devastating cycle of violence began with Gangitano's murder in 1998, under what some have claimed may even have been his hand, in his home in Melbourne. Unfortunately, up until today, the identity of the person who killed Gangitano has not been known. Still, such violence increased the conflict between Carlton crew and other crews that competed for power and influence inside Melbourne. Another leading character of Melbourne's violent group, who had significant impacts on the mentality of the criminal fraternity, was Jason Moran. Being a part of the Moran family, which was notorious in the city and involved in criminal activities, Jason's role in the drug business and a highly temperamental gunman, he was an influential figure in the criminal world. Moran and his life died in nexus with the dangers that entwined the gangland wars. Moran, infamous for his short temper and personal grudge against the rival Williams family, was one of the biggest players in the shooting war. He had a deadly beef with another mob boss, Carl Williams, who had plenty of power and wanted more. Their rivalry started after Williams beat Moran in a fight over drug money, a situation that led to a chain of deaths. Moran was tragically murdered in December of 2003 at a children's soccer game, shot 14 times in front of his son. The ruthlessness of many gangland figures during this period apparent to all. The Melbourne gangland wars were recognized as one of the most violent periods in the city's history, as it was estimated that between 1998 and 2010, 36 murders, most of which were a consequence of violence within and between the Carlton crew and rival gangs. During this period, the severity of attacks also stepped up, with drive-by shootings, public murder, and brutal flogging becoming the order of the day. That was how the Carlton crew, for years, one of the most formidable crime organizations in Melbourne, felt the heat from the Williams family and other aspiring competitors willing to seize the stakes of lucrative drug markets. The increasing violence meant that the codes of the earlier criminal subculture were diminishing. While the earlier penchant for hitting targets on the head in public was delivering a warning to others, more violent tactics were adopted with little regard to normal societal laws. Carl Williams and other young and more dangerous men brought a new kind of disorder to the gangland executions of the traditional leaders. During the period of the gangland wars, police forces present in Melbourne were overwhelmed by the amount of violent crimes happening regularly. The openness of many of these assaults, which included shootings and beatings taking place on the streets or in public places such as clubs or homes, put tremendous pressure on law enforcement agencies. Task Force Piranha was then formed to become a specific police force looking into the Melbourne organized crime syndicates. This particular task force was involved in effecting the apprehension of several top mobsters and assassins, among them Carl Williams, who was finally neutralized, having succeeded in having several of his close associates killed before he was ganged up and placed behind bars before being murdered in prison, signifying the end to the brutal gangland wars.
Where's that man running, Daddy?
Having become very public, the conflict gained much attention from mass media sources, familiarizing people with such personas as Gatto, Gangitano, or Moran. For the public, the Melbourne Gangland Wars exposed lots of truths about the city that were presented as friendly and serene, which was also influential and terrifying. These wars were not without effect on Melbourne's communities, in which the gangland figures were vilified, admired, and feared in equal measures. The events of the Melbourne Gangland Wars had a particular impact on the criminal tradition of the city. Brawling between members of the Carlton crew and other African-descended associations annihilated conventional authority. Assuming that a man can barely survive the bloodshed, let alone commit one, the leaders of the criminal world, such as McKell, were considered smart and savvy survivors. Gangitano, Moran, and Williams, however, found their lives cut short in the violence that characterized Melbourne's underworld, with many players becoming victims of the gun. The wars also influenced the public's perception towards the organization's crime. This established a lasting culture of people's interest in gangland persons and incidences. This remembrance remains current in Australian popular culture. Melbourne's criminal wars are still in documentaries, books, and television dramas. These characters are remembered as criminals without being entirely without virtue, as modern, popular anti-heroes. Therefore, the extended history of connections between organized crime and Melbourne, and the bloody history of Carlton crew being heavily involved in criminal activities throughout the city, denotes the place as the national and international symbol of crime and its risks and fascination. The McKell brothers, headed by Tony McKell, were liable for the revolution of Melbourne's underground and its connection with the international traffic market. These activities, which comprised local distribution and international drug trafficking, changed how drugs arrived in Melbourne and the structure of the criminal economy. Using complex smuggling and extended contact with other factions, Tony and his brothers took Melbourne to the next level of criminal cities in the world, and Melbourne became an important city in the drug trade. Tony McKell, the son of two Lebanese immigrants in Melbourne, initially worked on the fringes of Melbourne's criminal community. In the period up to the mid-1990s, he had already developed into a powerful figure in the narcotics market. As a master of strategy and a very skilled diplomat, Tony saw drug dealing as an extremely profitable business venture, especially in cocaine and ecstasy. It was a combination of guile, commercial sense, and knowledge of the city's drug market that saw McKell steadily build on his organization, drawing on his immediate family, brothers Hisham, Horty, and Milad, to assist him oversee and develop the fast-growing business. This tight-knit family environment enabled him to create a high level of trust and commitment that was still almost unheard of in Melbourne organized crime. When McKell took charge to lead his brothers, they decided to establish a crime fraternity called The Company, which was a complex criminal organization, wholesale dealing in drugs imported from South America. When McKell took the lead, he and his brothers decided to establish an organization known as The Company. This was a complex network that operated primarily in the distribution of illicit substances, sourcing products from various international regions and supplying them across Melbourne and other Australian cities. The organization focused on large-scale shipments, facilitating the movement of goods like cocaine from South America and ecstasy from Europe, using covert channels and locations in multiple countries. Tony and his brothers built extensive networks that connected Melbourne's underworld with global organizations, solidifying the city as a key transit point for these goods. A significant aspect of the company's operations was its money laundering system, one of the most sophisticated within McKell's network. They integrated laundering activities into businesses such as cafes, car dealerships, and real estate investments. This allowed them to transform proceeds from illicit activities into what appeared to be legitimate earnings. By doing so, they were able to reinvest those funds into further operations, without drawing significant attention. These businesses also helped the family present themselves as legitimate entrepreneurs, thus diverting suspicion from authorities and strengthening their influence. The success of the McKell brothers' ability to blend illicit income with the legal economy inspired other criminal groups in Melbourne to adopt similar strategies, attracted unequal attention from other organized crime associates, It brought admiration as well as rivalry among them, as well as other mobs in the underworld, especially as Tony expanded his empire so much in areas that were previously the preserve of other mafias. The smuggling and drug options created by the McKells weighed heavily on the Melbourne factions, as well as forced others to step up their game. Furthermore, their activities indicated situations where the transport of drugs internationally could be financially rewarding, and thus attracted the interest of different groups who wanted to engage in similar activities. This increased competition amongst the crime syndicates was partly responsible for an era of relative cooperation and outright hostility. When the McKells expanded their activities to a wider level, police forces became interested in them. McKell's egotistical expansion and persona as the Mr. Big of the Australian narcotics trade placed him under the scrutiny of the Australian Federal Police and Task Force Piranha, both of whom began increasing efforts to dismantle McKell's network. That was a major loss to the McKell empire, and to make it worse, in 2006, Tony McKell was convicted of drug trafficking. Having been condemned to a long jail term, McKell escaped to his home country, Australia, and began one of the most publicized manhunts in the country's history. He went to Greece to live there, changing his identity for almost 18 months, but continued to lead a life as a fugitive with the proceeds of the drug business. However, in 2007, those authorities arrested him, and he was deported to Australia in 2008, where he received more charges. Melbourne's drug trade was dramatically affected when McKell was arrested because his capture created a leadership void that various individuals filled. Though weakening the company, law enforcement erased large portions of his operation, and several of his subordinates were either apprehended or left with no choice but to court other criminal syndicates. However, it cannot be denied that the McKells left their mark on Melbourne's drug scene. They had reset the meter on the velocity and bang for the buck of narcotics within the city. It continued to live on in other structures that other criminal organizations imposed, and people continued to rely on other ways inspired by McKell to exercise the control they desired on drug circulation.
Melbourne drug kingpin Tony McKell is fighting to be freed from jail over the Lawyer X scandal, claiming it was Nicola Gobbo's idea for him to flee overseas. The former Underworld boss today told the Supreme Court he fully trusted Ms. Gobbo before she double-crossed him.
The new emphasis on globalization was reflected in Melbourne's underworld growth, and the McKells' success was one example. They had shown that affiliation with the global community and complex supply chains could transform small criminal businesses into something that has never been seen before regarding power and valuation. The story of the McKell brothers also raised the issue of the difficulties that authorities have faced in fighting such great international drug syndicates that are well organized, fully funded, and coordinated cross-nationally. However, even after capturing Tony, Melbourne's underworld becomes unrecognizable as new patterns and types of drug trade emerge and become even more sophisticated. The McKells shaped the generation of criminal endeavors, those ready to go international, develop new types of criminal activities, and take higher risks for higher benefits. More recently, Melbourne has experienced a diversification of the gangs, with a more fractured and ethnically diverse style, as exemplified by George Morogi. The case of Morogi, a man who dominates and controls Melbourne's gang scene, is indicative of the change in approach of these groups as they become more strategic. The criminal structures of previous centuries have been highly unique and closed, family-like organizations. The modern structure of criminal groups differs from ethnic, mainly having links by ethnic origin and crossing state borders. This has culminated in a very unhealthy environment, filled with ethnic rival gangs, especially the Lebanese, Vietnamese, and many others making up Melbourne's criminal market. A Lebanese-Australian gang leader, George Morogi, presents Melbourne's modern face of organized crime. Nicknamed the head of notorious crime family, NCF, Morogi had to assert his power through violence, intelligence, and timely learning of new power players in the ambition sphere of crime. His organization is very businesslike in its crime model, with a primary focus on drug dealing, arms dealing, and imposing authority over other criminals. Even in prison, Morogi remains the head and director of the NCF, proving that contemporary criminals are very versatile and cannot be easily tackled. Morogi has been employing advanced technology and a vast network through which he covers the region of his operations. Such a level of organization has enabled him to lead the large-scale drug network and to coordinate with other gang heads, most of the time through concealed and tactically delicate ways that make the work of the police difficult. This ability to carry on managing operations from prison is something that authorities have to face, as today's crimes are much more shielded from law enforcement actions than in older times. Through Morogi's leadership within the NCF, the public sees the authority that one can hold within the criminal world, commanding both respect and presumably fear from the criminal fraternity within Melbourne. For years, ethnic backgrounds have played a role in crime in Melbourne, as post-war immigrants formed organized gangs that sought dominance over some spheres of crime and demanded respect from other groups. The Lebanese, Vietnamese, and others have all become a part of a multicultural criminal society that can be united significantly by oppression and feelings of isolation from society. In the Lebanese community, persons like Morogi and other gang leaders have very strong roots and thus power in society, as they use relatives and communities to entrench themselves. These groups deal in drug trafficking activities, smuggling of weapons, and other criminal activities of an organization nature. They are frequently involved in competition or synergy with other ethnic groups. As for the Vietnamese gangs, the most significant involvement of this group was in marijuana cultivation and trafficking, though their work has become more professional over the years. Most of these gangs create networks that cover other states apart from Melbourne and are normally involved in secret safe houses and hidden plantations. Crimes related to Vietnamese gangs and other ethnic groups like the Lebanese gangs are involved sometimes, usually when some issues like territory and drug market share are issues. This rivalry fits into the ethnic gang structure of the city, where criminal organizations fight each other or partner depending on conflicting or mutual interests. To make the relations between these groups even more complex, all of them are related to international syndicates. For instance, Lebanese gangs have relations with the Middle Eastern crime syndicates, allowing them to supply and move huge quantities of drugs. Vietnamese-related, in some instances, are affiliated with the SE Asians that help in the shipping of all forms of narcotics in and out of the country. These overseas affiliations increase their might and place them as big fishes in Melbourne, since they can tap into organizational assets and shielding from bigger, global, unlawful structures apart from Australia. Another factor distinguishing postmodern ethnic gangs is their flexibility, or rather, pragmatism. These groups are not as loyal as before to the traditional rival cartels or geographical borders, but instead more focused on coordination to gain power or make more money. Therefore, the two groups may well decide to combine forces if the rewards gained from the substance distribution process surpass the possible costs. This trend is observable against the backdrop of the generic nature of the complex of organized crime, where financial gains motivate affiliations and shape animosities. Self-interest and flexibility, which allegedly motivated Melbourne gangsters, from pragmatic points of view, seem to be far more important for the current bosses of criminal organizations than the concepts of absolute loyalty and honor, characteristic of previous generations of the leaders of criminal gangs. This has also been upheld in the business they have developed by embracing and incorporating other crimes such as extortion, money laundering, dealing in drugs, and other social canal crimes, including cybercrimes. The new opportunities of digital technology have given these groups a new way to make money and mumble. They can use new encrypted communication technologies to organize their activities without leaving traces. For example, ethnic gangs make use of social media and encrypted messaging applications when it comes to recruiting members, selling substances, and even resolving conflicts about their capabilities to adapt to new conditions. Criminals have always posed a great challenge to law enforcement authorities in Melbourne, especially when combating well-established criminal networks. Not forgetting the ever-changing modus operandi. The authorities have used various tactics, from conducting specific operations and special task forces to widespread surveillance and legislation that reduces the power of Melbourne's crime figures. Nevertheless, the extraordinary growth of powerful crime syndicates in Melbourne means that these elements have become intertwined with the history and culture of the city, affecting media, police work, and the public consciousness. The policing of organized crime in Melbourne has grown in response to the development of these groups and the sophistication of their activities. In the first decades of the 20th century, criminal organizations were in the hands of the leaders and small groups involved in smuggling, racketeering, and gambling. Nevertheless, as these groups grew and evolved, the police intervention was changed from uncoordinated and non-systematic raids and arrests in nightclubs, etc., to more systematic and planned actions that ultimately led to the creation of the special task forces. For instance, the gangland wars during the late 20th and the 21st century saw the rise of organized crime, which led to the formation of Task Force Piranha, a selective target police force with a specific ambition to confront gangland violence and the networks of high-profile mobsters as Carl Williams, McKell, and the Moran family. It was the first time that Task Force Piranha's operations redefined the architecture through which it is possible to approach organized crime. Unlike many other firms that engaged in firefighting measures, Piranha sought to employ preventive measures, which entailed systematic surveillance, utilization of undercover operatives, and cooperation with intelligence bodies. By procuring information through cooperation with other police units, it was possible to dismantle crime syndicates on different levels, thus making many high-ranking syndicates amenable to the law. But these successes were not without a price. The gang's revenge on informants and witnesses endangered people and distended resources. Apart from Task Force Piranha, Melbourne law enforcement agencies also established other units and actions, refocusing on the particular tasks of organized crime. For instance, to fight ethnic gang influence in cities, the police created the Anti-Gang Squad to fight the sale of drugs, which criminal organizations consider a major source of revenue. These specialized units helped law enforcement to transform into a new type that could address the emerging aspects of organized crime with new problems specific to Melbourne's underground environment. Ironically, crime statistics have remained high, and they have diversified their tactics, going online or offering elusive methods of laundering money that make it difficult for law enforcers to comprehend them. Legal reforms to strengthen law enforcement's capacity to address organized crime have also been extended to the law enforcement agencies in Melbourne. For instance, the introduction of tougher anti-gang and anti-association laws has enhanced police efforts to break up criminal networks. These laws prohibit authorized gang members from contacting each other, making it easier for crime syndicates to work in their order of choice. In addition, some new laws also made it possible for law enforcement agencies to seize assets derived from criminal activities, reducing the profitability of engaging in organized crime. Additionally, advances in forensic science have improved the ability to collect and analyze evidence.
There's a need to be a little bit cautious here because there are some current matters before the court where this whole issue may well be central to those matters. But I think it's now a matter of record that corruption, police corruption, was definitely a factor in allowing some of these people to get to the position they got to and then assisting them to remain there.
Making it easier to tie crime data to specific cases. This is especially important in a criminal ecosystem where anonymity and privacy are highly valued. For example, encrypted communications have become commonplace among gangs, prompting authorities to hire cybersecurity experts and specialized software to crack these codes and uncover hidden phone numbers.